Before Rome, before Greece, there was Babylon, a city built for gods and broken by empires. This is not myth. This is memory written in clay, carved in stone, and buried in dust. Babylon. The very name echoes through time as both wonder and warning. It conjures visions of immense walls crowned with golden towers, of priests whispering to stars, of kings who wrote laws in stone and claimed to speak for gods. For centuries, it has lived in memory as a symbol. A city of splendor. A city of sin. A city whose rise and fall were as dramatic as any myth ever told. But before it became a legend, it was a place. A real one. Nestled along the shifting banks of the Euphrates in what is now Iraq, Babylon began as little more than a village in the shadow of older powers. No one could have guessed what it would become, not the Akkadian scribes who first etched its name into clay, not the Amorite chieftains who later seized its gates. And yet, somehow Babylon rose. Not by accident. Not by fate. But through blood, ambition, devotion, and an unshakable belief that the city itself was chosen by the gods. In its day it was called Kadingurare, the gate of the god. And for over 1,000 years, empires would rise and fall through that gate. So today we step back into that world. Not through the lens of myth, but through the eyes of the Babylonians themselves, the kings, the priests, the scholars, the builders, the rebels, all of them etched into clay and buried beneath layers of time. This is not just the story of a city. It is the story of the ancient world's first true metropolis. A place where power met poetry. Where law met legend. Where heaven, some believed, touched the earth. Welcome to Babylon. But before Babylon became a city of divine towers and world-spanning ambition, it began as all cities do, in obscurity. A name without a face. A place without a voice. Long before Hammurabi or Nebuchadnezzar, before laws were carved or gates gilded, Babylon was simply one of many settlements that dotted the great Mesopotamian plain, a modest town resting quietly along the banks of the Euphrates. Archaeology and cuneiform texts suggest the site was inhabited as early as the 3rd millennium BCE, but in those early centuries Babylon stood in the long shadow of giants. Uar, with its soaring ziggurat to the moon god Nana, Kish, ancient and powerful, and Nippur, sacred to Enlil, the lord of wind and order. Babylon, by contrast, was young, unimportant, its name barely spoken. The earliest known textual reference to Babylon appears not in Babylonian records, but in the imperial yearname of an Akkadian king, Sharkali-Sheri, around 2200 BCE. One of his regnal titles commemorates the construction of temples at a site called Kadingura, the gate of the god. Taking the name literally, historians and linguists now accept that Kadingura is the earliest written name for Babylon. It tells us something crucial. Even in its infancy, Babylon was already conceptualized in sacred terms. The city was envisioned as a threshold, a point where heaven touched earth. At this stage, Babylon was neither large nor independent. It was administered under the Akkadian Empire, governed by officials known as Ensi, city governors subordinate to the king in Akkad. It likely owed tribute, supplied labor, and watched as Akkad's armies marched east and west, carving out the first Mesopotamian empire. Later Mesopotamian chronicles, perhaps more legend than fact, would ascribe the founding of Babylon to the great conqueror Sargon of Akkad himself, dating it around 2330 BCE. While this is likely a retrospective myth, the story itself reveals something telling. That even centuries later, Babylonians wished to tie their origins to the most prestigious names of Mesopotamian history. That even in legend, Babylon was never content to be ordinary. But the collapse of the Akkadian Empire around 2150 BCE, under pressure from famine, internal revolt, and nomadic invasions, broke the first chain of empire in the region. Southern Mesopotamia fractured into competing city-states. The third dynasty of Ur arose briefly to restore order, but Babylon was nowhere near its center. For a time, Babylon disappears from the historical record, lost again in the noise of larger cities. Yet while the cuneiform tablets fall silent, the soil tells another story. Archaeological excavations have revealed the outlines of early walls, domestic structures, and shrines, small, yes, but distinct. Babylon persisted. And as the generations passed, the city's fortunes would shift once again. In the centuries after the fall of Ur, new waves of people drifted into Mesopotamia, West Semitic speakers from the deserts and highlands beyond the Euphrates. These newcomers, later called the Amorites, brought with them tribal traditions, divine patrons, and a fierce independence. And they would soon change Babylon's fate forever. As the third dynasty of Ur crumbled under its own weight, buckling from nomadic pressure, dwindling harvests, and internal unrest, Mesopotamia entered a time of fragmentation. Power shifted like wind-blown sand. Babylon, still small and largely forgotten, lay on the edge of great events. But history is full of moments where the margins suddenly become the center. Into this unstable landscape came a new people, the Amorites, West Semitic tribes from the fringes of the Fertile Crescent. Known to the Sumerians as Martu, these groups had long lived in the desert steppe, but by the early 2nd millennium BCE, they began to settle in the cities of the south. To older Mesopotamians, the Amorites were seen as outsiders, uncouth, rural, unfamiliar with urban rituals or temple laws. One Sumerian text mockingly describes them as those who know not grain, who eat raw meat, and do not bury their dead. Yet the Amorites were no mere raiders. They adapted quickly to the urban world. They learned Akkadian. They worshipped the gods of the land. And in some cases they rose to power. Around 1894 BCE, one such Amorite chieftain, Neo-Babylonian, seized control of Babylon. His name, meaning he is the son of the father, now marks the beginning of Babylon's first recorded dynasty. It was not yet an empire. It was barely even a kingdom. But it was Babylon's first step out of anonymity. Neo-Babylonian did not call himself King of Babylon, at least not at first. Early rulers like him used more modest titles, often naming themselves simply as governor or ensi. The city remained one among many, overshadowed by larger and more ancient powers. To the south stood Larsa, ruled by ambitious Amorite kings who controlled the canals and grain routes of Sumer. To the east, the storied city of Eshnunna held the middle Tigris. Even nearby Isin and Ur carried more political clout. Babylon was not feared. It was not admired. It was tolerated. And yet it endured. Neo-Babylonian's successors, including Sumalel, began expanding Babylon's territory. They built fortification walls and asserted limited autonomy. Their rule saw small but significant shifts: the establishment of local cults, the carving out of defensible borders, and the slow rise of Babylon's civic identity. Archaeological remains from this period are sparse, often buried beneath later layers. But in the soil, archaeologists have found traces of early mud brick ramparts and foundation deposits inscribed with royal names. The city may not have been magnificent, but it was organizing itself. More importantly, it was beginning to dream not just of survival but of significance. During this time, Babylon began elevating a once minor local deity, Marduk. Initially one among many gods, Marduk would gradually take on a larger role, representing not just divine power but Babylon itself. He became the city's symbol, its guardian, and its identity. In later centuries, priests would say that Marduk chose Babylon, not the other way around. But here, in these early Amorite centuries, the process was more human. A young city sought a god to call its own, a spiritual cornerstone around which to build its future. Babylon's rise was not sudden. It was not dramatic. But it was steady. And in this slow burn of political consolidation and cultural formation, Babylon laid the foundation for everything it would one day become. A city of kings, a city of gods, a city that, for a moment in time, would stand at the very center of the world. Before we go any further, if you've been here before, thank you. Seriously. Your time, your comments, your curiosity, that's what keeps this channel breathing. And if this is your first time joining us, welcome. You've just stepped into a corner of the internet where history is allowed to breathe without shortcuts. Now, if you haven't subscribed yet, well, we'll still keep making these stories for you. But if you do enjoy this kind of work, slow burning, detail-rich, human-first history, a quick click helps more than you think. And if you're one of those people who just refuses to subscribe on principle, fair enough. But at least tell us why in the comments. We love a good debate down there. Alright, back to Babylon. Babylon's early kings built walls. They secured borders. They dreamed in clay. But it would take a man of unusual vision and unrelenting ambition to turn that dream into empire. That man was Hammurabi, sixth king in the Amorite line. He rose to power around 1792 BCE, inheriting a modest domain in a dangerous world. Babylon at this point was still dwarfed by its neighbors. To the south stood Larsa, ruled by Rim-Sin-I, who had reigned for over 60 years and held vast sway over the Sumerian canal systems. To the north, the city of Eshnunna flexed its muscle across the Diyala River. And in the west, the ancient city of Mari still controlled the key trade routes from Syria and beyond. Hammurabi did not begin with swords. He began with strategy. For the first half of his reign, he strengthened Babylon from within. He restored temples, improved irrigation systems, codified laws, and critically presented himself as a servant of Marduk, the city's divine protector. He formed alliances, avoided large-scale war, and paid careful attention to the pulse of the region. But this peace was not hesitation. It was calculation. As other city-states weakened themselves in battle, Hammurabi waited. And when the moment came, he struck. Between 1764 and 1755 BCE, Babylon waged an astonishing series of successful campaigns. Hammurabi turned his army and his gods outward. He overran Larsa, capturing its vast canal network. He subdued Eshnunna, cutting off its northern lifelines. And then he reached further still, launching a campaign against Mari, a city rich in trade, culture, and military history. Rare tablets from Mari's own royal archives unearthed in the 20th century at Tel Hariri show us just how sudden and decisive Hammurabi's actions were. The king of Mari, Zimri-Lim, had once been Hammurabi's ally. They had exchanged gifts, letters, even royal daughters. But when Mari's support faltered, Hammurabi razed the city. It was not personal. It was imperial. In a single generation, Babylon went from provincial outpost to unchallenged hegemon of southern Mesopotamia. Hammurabi's titles changed with his victories. Where once he had called himself King of Babylon, he now bore loftier names: King of Sumer and Akkad, King of the Four Quarters of the Earth, ancient phrases used to signal total dominion. But perhaps the most telling change was not in title, but in perception. The lands once known as Sumer and Akkad began to be called simply Babylonia. Babylon young, once overshadowed, once irrelevant, now gave its name to an entire civilization. The old spiritual center of Nippur faded into ceremonial memory. It was Babylon now that dictated ritual, law, and myth. Its patron god, Marduk, was elevated above Enlil. Its walls, newly expanded and reinforced, encircled temples, palaces, granaries, and scholarly halls. The city, once peripheral, became the axis around which southern Mesopotamia turned. Even Hammurabi's enemies had to acknowledge the shift. One unearthed tablet from Eshnunna includes a prayer to Marduk, who now watches all lands from the center. It is not a Babylonian tablet. It is a concession to reality. Babylon had become not just a city but a center of gravity. And at the heart of it all was Hammurabi, not only a king, but the architect of Babylon's first empire. His legacy, etched into stone, would echo for millennia. When Hammurabi's armies quieted the south, and the dust of war began to settle, the land that had once fractured into rival kingdoms began to be called by a single name: Babylonia. It was more than a geographical label. It was a redefinition, a cultural reset. For centuries, the lands between the Tigris and Euphrates had been known as Sumer and Akkad, names that spoke of older capitals: Ur, Kish, Akkad, Nippur. These were places of ancient prestige, where the gods were thought to dwell and where the fate of kings was once read in omens. But now, everything pointed toward Babylon. Hammurabi's unification of the region wasn't merely military, it was symbolic. Babylon's temples began to assert theological centrality. Its scribes restructured liturgies. Its god, Marduk, once a local deity of modest standing, began to ascend a divine hierarchy that had long been dominated by Enlil, the supreme deity of Nippur. This was no accident. It was a quiet revolution, spiritual and political, encoded in ritual. One of the most striking artifacts of this shift is the Enuma Elish, Babylon's creation epic, composed in the generations after Hammurabi. In this myth, Marduk defeats the primordial chaos and is granted kingship over the gods. He is crowned not just as a cosmic victor, but as the new Lord of Order, replacing Enlil himself. The myth does not just tell a story, it justifies a new world order. Babylon is now the axis. Marduk is now the judge. And the rest of the land must follow. This theological recentering mirrored political reality. Where once Nippur had been the spiritual compass of the land, the city where kings were confirmed, where divine decrees were received, Babylon now assumed that role. The city's Akita festival, originally a New Year's rite, was expanded under Hammurabi's dynasty into a national event, with kings required to humble themselves before Marduk in a ceremonial act of submission. It was not only a celebration, it was a ritual of legitimacy. Without it, a ruler's authority was considered hollow. Temple personnel and high priests who had once journeyed to Nippur now made pilgrimage to Babylon's Asagila, the temple complex of Marduk. Its name meant, the house that raises its head, and its ziggurat, known as Edamananki, was said to touch the heavens. And in an even subtler shift, scribes began referring to the land using Babylon's name. Letters, administrative records, even omen texts now labeled the realm as Kiur Kardingararaki, the land of Babylon. In a Mesopotamian worldview, naming meant ownership. And by naming the land, Babylon claimed it. Rare administrative texts show the practical implications. Archives from cities like Sippar and Borsippa begin referencing Babylonian timekeeping, Babylonian weights and measures and rituals, as performed in Babylon. Even eclipse omens were interpreted according to positions observed from Babylon's ziggurat, not Nippur's. Babylon did not erase the past, it absorbed it. It took the bones of Sumer and Akkad and built something new from them. To the outside world this mattered. Foreign kings now addressed Babylonian rulers with increasing reverence. Diplomatic letters such as those found in Amarna, Egypt, show Babylon as a spiritual authority, not merely a trading partner. In every way that mattered, religiously, administratively, cosmologically, Babylon had become the heart of the world it once watched from afar. And as the name Babylonia settled across the floodplains, it did something even more powerful than unify. It redefined. Now that Babylon had conquered the land, it needed something even more powerful than armies or shrines, a system of order. Hammurabi gave it law, and more than law, ideology written in stone. Around 1754 BCE, toward the end of his long reign, Hammurabi commissioned a massive black stele of polished diorite. On it, he inscribed 282 legal judgments, drawn from palace rulings, city traditions, and temple decrees. These laws, etched in the sharp, stylized cuneiform of the Old Babylonian dialect, would become known to modern scholars as the Code of Hammurabi. But this was not merely a legal document. It was a public performance and act of divine legitimacy. The stele opens with a prologue, carved in poetic language. When the exalted Anu, king of the gods, and Enlil, lord of heaven and earth, gave to Marduk rule over mankind, they made him the supreme god. Then Marduk called me Hammurabi, the devout prince, to make justice prevail in the land, to destroy the wicked and the evil, so that the strong might not oppress the weak. The message is unmistakable. Hammurabi did not claim to create justice. He claimed to channel it as the chosen instrument of the gods. And just as Babylon had redefined divinity, it now claimed to define law. The stele was placed not in a palace, but in the temple of Marduk, meant to be seen by the public, even if few could read it. Copies were also distributed across Babylonian cities, including Sippar and Larsa. These were not meant for daily reference. They were monuments, symbols. The law is spectacle. The contents of the code paint a vivid portrait of Babylonian life, complex, hierarchical, and deeply transactional. There are laws regulating prices for grain, livestock, and beer, punishments for theft, fraud, and false testimony, penalties for failed surgical operations and negligent builders. One law declares, if a builder builds a house and it collapses, killing the owner, the builder shall be put to death. Another, if a man puts out the eye of a noble, his eye shall be put out. But if he puts out the eye of a commoner, he shall pay 1 mina of silver. Justice was precise and deeply stratified. A freeborn man, a commoner, and a slave each had separate legal weights, even in death. Women had legal protections, but their rights were tied to their role as wives, daughters, or widows. Contracts and dowries defined marriage. Divorce was permitted but regulated. In cases of temple theft, punishments were more severe. Hammurabi's law was not just civic, it was theocratic. To steal from a temple was to offend the gods. To disrupt the order was to threaten the fabric of reality itself. Yet alongside the violence and hierarchy lies something else, a desire for clarity. The code standardized weights and measures. It defined land boundaries and irrigation responsibilities crucial in a region where canals determined survival. It regulated debt slavery, ensuring limits and timelines. It punished corrupt judges and protected orphans and widows, at least in theory. It was not a perfect system. It was not universal justice. But it was an effort rare in the ancient world to impose consistent law over a sprawling, diverse, multi-ethnic kingdom. And in this, it outlived its maker. Hammurabi died shortly after the code was issued, but his stele remained standing for centuries. It was so powerful a symbol that when the Elamites conquered Babylon in the 12th century BCE, they took the stele as plunder, transporting it all the way to Susa, where it would lie buried until its rediscovery by archaeologists in 1901. Today, the Code of Hammurabi sits in the Louvre, cracked, incomplete, but still legible. And while modern legal systems owe little directly to its clauses, its spirit endures. That justice, even flawed, even unequal, is something a ruler must answer for. That power without law is not civilization. And that stone, when written well enough, can outlive empires. After Hammurabi carved his laws into stone, he left behind more than empire and authority. He left behind a city that thought and recorded. Babylon's true power would not lie solely in its armies or its temples, but in its scribes, men trained not to rule with sword or prayer, but with numbers, words, and stars. By the mid-18th century BCE, Babylon had become one of the most advanced centers of learning in the ancient world. Its scribal academies trained generations in the precise art of cuneiform, the wedge-shaped writing system inherited from Sumer and refined by Akkad. It was not an alphabet, but a complex system of hundreds of characters, each one a fusion of sound, meaning, and context. Learning to write it took years, even decades. Trainee scribes, often sons of bureaucrats or priests, began with basic signs, then moved to proverbs, legal phrases, hymns, and finally to technical texts. Clay tablets from these scribal schools, called adubas or tablet houses, still survive today, complete with the clumsy strokes of beginners correcting their mistakes under a teacher's sharp eye. But Babylonian learning did not stop at literacy. It reached for the structure of reality itself. Babylonian mathematicians developed a system that still shapes our world. Base 60 numerals. This sexagesimal system is why we divide hours into 60 minutes, and circles into 360 degrees. It was efficient for dealing with fractions and time, but also elegant in its own right. It allowed complex calculations that would not be matched again for over a millennium. One of the most astonishing artifacts of this system is the clay tablet now known as Plimpton 322, dated to around 1800 BCE, during or just after Hammurabi's reign. Found in what was once the Babylonian city of Larsa, it contains a list of numerical triplets that correspond to what we now call Pythagorean triples 1,000 years before Pythagoras. The layout is methodical, and its purpose debated. Was it a teaching tool, a trigonometric table, or a record of field measurements? Whatever its intent, its existence tells us this: Babylonian mathematics was not primitive. It was sophisticated, abstract, and deeply embedded in civic and spiritual life. The same was true for astronomy. Babylonian sky watchers observed the heavens with precision and patience, recording the motions of Venus, Jupiter, eclipses, and lunar cycles. Though the zodiac system we know today would come later, Babylonian stargazers already tracked celestial patterns for both scientific and omenological purposes. Rare tablets show how these observations were not mere superstition. Babylonian astronomers developed arithmetical models to predict planetary positions. They divided the sky into 3 bands and assigned omens not just to stars but to their movement. This dual use of astronomy as both science and divination was not contradiction, but cosmic symmetry. To the Babylonians, the heavens were a system of divine signs, but also a system to be measured, understood, and replicated. And so, Babylon became a city where measurement was sacred, where writing was ritual, where the stars were both gods and guides. This intellectual culture left behind a staggering body of texts, not just law and astronomy, but medicine, agriculture, theology, commerce, and lexicography. In some temple archives, scribes produced lexical lists of over 2,000 entries, the first known attempts at cataloging human language. These lists were copied and recopied for centuries, passed down like sacred scripture. Even in decline, Babylon's intellectual legacy endured. When foreign powers, Assyrians, Persians, Greeks, took the city, they preserved its scribes. They translated its tablets. They absorbed its calculations. Babylon remained a school of the world, long after its kings had vanished. In the end, what Babylon built in stone was impressive. But what it wrote in clay and in mind may be its greatest legacy. Babylon had risen from obscurity into empire. Under Hammurabi, it had unified the land, redefined justice, and mapped the stars. But empires, like temples, crack from within long before they collapse from without. Hammurabi died in 1750 BCE, after a reign of over 40 years. He was succeeded by his son, Samsu-Iluna, who inherited not just a kingdom but the weight of a myth. Babylon was no longer one city among many, it was the city. But maintaining a legacy built by a singular ruler proved far harder than expanding it. Samsu-Iluna's reign was marked by instability and rebellion. The empire Hammurabi had stitched together began to fray almost immediately. Southern cities like Ur, Isin, and Larsa, ancient Sumerian centers that had been annexed under Hammurabi, revolted repeatedly. The canals that once fed fields and cities were neglected or destroyed in the fighting. Even Mari, subdued during Hammurabi's lifetime, regained influence under shadowy local rulers, a reminder that conquest could not always outlast memory. A prolonged climate shift and drop in the water table further strained Babylon's agrarian economy. Grain yields fell. Rural populations dwindled. Records suggest that internal migration increased, people abandoning southern fields to escape famine or taxation. Tax receipts plummet in the tablets. Temple offerings grow sparse. Scribal activity slows. The signs are everywhere. Babylon was hollowing from the inside. Yet its collapse, when it came, was not a slow decay. It was a shock. In 1595 BCE, nearly 150 years after Hammurabi's great unification, Babylon was hit by something unexpected: a sudden raid by the Hittites, a people from Anatolia who had only recently begun expanding south. The Hittite king Mursili I led a swift military campaign that cut through northern Mesopotamia and sacked Babylon in a single brutal blow. The details are sparse, but chilling. Babylon's walls were breached. Temples were looted. The sacred statue of Marduk was seized and carried away, a gesture not only of victory, but of theological humiliation. To steal a god was to unmake a city. What makes this moment so extraordinary is that the Hittites did not stay. Mursili did not occupy Babylon, nor attempt to govern it. He struck and left. A symbolic strike more than territorial conquest. Some historians believe the campaign was meant to assert dominance over Babylon's allies, or to disrupt the growing power of rivals like Mitanni or Assyria. But to Babylon it didn't matter why. In a single season, the imperial project of Hammurabi ended. What followed was vacuum. No single power replaced Babylon immediately. Instead, northern rivals, most notably the Kassites, a people of uncertain origin from the Zagros region, gradually filled the void. Over the next few decades, they would establish a dynasty in Babylon, but this was not the empire of Hammurabi. It was something else, new, cautious, and foreign. The old Babylonian period had come to an end. The schools remained. The scribes wrote. The temples reopened. But something was missing: a center. For nearly a century, Babylonia would remain a fractured land, ruled by memories, myths, and others. In the aftermath of Babylon's collapse, silence fell. The walls still stood, but the voice of the empire was gone. Into that silence came strangers, not as conquerors, but as caretakers of a broken crown. They were called the Kassites. Their origins lay to the northeast, likely in the Zagros Mountains, in a region that today lies near the border of Iran and Iraq. Their language was neither Semitic nor Sumerian. In fact, it is still only partially understood. No lengthy inscriptions survive in their native tongue. What we know of them comes from what they became, not from what they were. Initially, the Kassites appeared in Mesopotamian records as mercenaries and mountain tribes, often in the service of more powerful kings. But after the Hittites sacked Babylon in 1595 BCE and then abruptly withdrew, the Kassites began to rise. Not through conquest but through persistence. Over the following decades they slowly consolidated control. By c. 1475 BCE, the Kassites had established full dominion over Babylon and founded what would become the longest-lasting dynasty in the city's history, nearly 400 years, far surpassing even Hammurabi's line. Their kings adopted Babylonian names, upheld Babylonian deities, and revered Babylonian law. They did not erase the culture they inherited it deliberately. Temples were rebuilt. Trade resumed. The scribal schools reopened under Kassite supervision. The image of Marduk, stolen by the Hittites, was ceremonially returned. It was not Babylon that changed the Kassites. It was the Kassites who chose to become Babylonian. Yet subtle transformations took place. They introduced new administrative terms, some drawn from their homeland, like the word Kurigalzu, meaning king. They built a new capital at Dur-Kurigalzu west of Babylon, near modern-day Baghdad. There they constructed a royal palace complex, complete with temples and ziggurats, one of which still stands in ruin, its bricks stamped with Kassite royal names. The Kassites reorganized Babylon's provincial structure, dividing the land into more tightly governed districts. They also reformed land ownership, granting large estates to military officers, often under a new system of sealed land grants known as kaduras. These stone boundary markers, carved with cuneiform and divine symbols, recorded tax exemptions, land rights, and curses for violators. Many still survive, offering insight into Kassite legal philosophy which, while modeled on Hammurabi's, placed greater emphasis on ritual boundaries and divine endorsement. The Kassite period also witnessed diplomatic expansion. Babylon entered into correspondence with Egypt's New Kingdom pharaohs, as recorded in the Amarna letters. These tablets show Kassite kings exchanging gifts and royal daughters with Egypt, Hutti, and Elam, placing Babylon squarely in the web of late Bronze Age diplomacy. In one such letter, a Kassite king writes to Pharaoh Akhenaten, "Gold is like dust in your land. Send much. Let us be brothers." These were not the words of an invader. These were the gestures of equals. The Kassite rulers ruled with Babylon, not over it. And that distinction mattered. In the eyes of later Babylonian scribes, the Kassites were not remembered as foreign tyrants but as diligent stewards, stabilizers in a time of vulnerability. Their names were preserved in king lists. Their reforms continued for generations. And even after their dynasty ended, the system they built, land grants, provincial rule, temple restoration, remained intact. The Kassites arrived as outsiders. They left as Babylonians. As the Kassites settled into rule over Babylon, they did something subtle and extraordinary. They turned a fractured realm into a diplomatic power, respected not only by its neighbors but by its rivals. This was the late Bronze Age international system, an age of kings who treated one another not as enemies, but as brothers. And in this world, Babylon found its place not on the margins but at the table. Four powers defined this age: Egypt, Hutti, the Hittite Empire, Mitanni, and Babylon. Later, Assyria would rise too, but for a moment, the Kassites sat among giants. Their authority came not from military conquest, but from etiquette, economy, and sacred continuity. Proof of this world survives not in legend but in letters. In the 14th century BCE, in the Egyptian city of Amarna, a trove of over 350 clay tablets was discovered, diplomatic correspondence between pharaohs and foreign kings. Many of these tablets were written in Akkadian, the diplomatic lingua franca of the age. And among them were letters from Babylon's Kassite kings. The tone of these letters is not humble. It is measured, confident, equal. One Babylonian king, likely Kadasman-Enlil-I, writes to Pharaoh Amenhotep III, "You are my brother. I have sent you fine horses and lapis lazuli. Where is the gold you promised me? Send more as befits kings. Let there be no shortage of love between us." These were not just letters. They were ritualized performances, each word carefully chosen to affirm status. To call another king brother was to recognize him as your peer. A failure to send the expected gifts, gold, ivory, garments, royal daughters, was not just discourtesy. It was a diplomatic insult. The Babylonian kings played this game well. They positioned themselves as guardians of ancient wisdom, heirs of Hammurabi and Marduk, stewards of a city that still whispered divine favor. While Egypt boasted of monuments and wealth, Babylon boasted of age and intellect. "You may have gold," one Kassite ruler implied, "but we have the gods." Rare fragments show that Babylonian embassies often brought not just luxuries, but text copies of omens, medical recipes, and even lexical lists, reinforcing Babylon's role as a cultural anchor of the known world. Their position was further enhanced by Babylon's strategic geography. Sitting between the great river routes and the eastern mountains, Babylon controlled access to trade flowing in from Elam, Dilmun, modern Bahrain, and even the distant Indus Valley. Spices, wool, tin, lapis lazuli, and horses all passed through Babylonian markets. Their currency was reputation as much as silver. And reputation could be enforced through diplomacy. When rival kings faltered, when Mitanni began to collapse under pressure from Hatti, Babylonian scribes took note. Some letters from this period are strikingly cold. They signal shifting alliances, feigned sympathies, and subtle threats. In one tablet, a Babylonian king warns the pharaoh, "Your envoy came with no gifts. This is not how brothers behave. Shall I treat you as a vassal next?" Behind the polite formulas and ceremonial greetings lay a realpolitik as sharp as any blade. And yet this system worked for a time. It held together an empire of voices, a network of letters and treaties stretching from Nile to Euphrates. Babylon, once looted and forgotten, now dictated the tempo of diplomacy. Not with armies, not with fire, but with clay and the weight of a seal pressed firm upon it. The kings of the Kassite dynasty ruled Babylon for 4 centuries. They did not conquer the world, but they preserved one. While other empires boasted of conquests and gold, the Kassites quietly tended to memory. And in doing so, they became custodians of humanity's oldest stories. By the 14th century BCE, Babylonian temples and scribal schools had become sanctuaries for literature, and not just the transactional tablets of trade or law, but something more sacred: epic, myth, cosmology, and devotion. 2 texts in particular would survive this age to echo down the millennia. The first was the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation epic. Under Kassite patronage, it was refined, formalized, and copied in temples, especially during the New Year festival, Akitu, in Babylon, when it was recited aloud in ritual procession. The story tells of Marduk, Babylon's patron god, who slays the chaos dragon Tiamat and brings order to the cosmos. He builds the heavens from her corpse and establishes kingship, not by inheritance but by merit, elected by the divine council. It was more than myth. It was theology as political philosophy. Marduk's triumph was Babylon's legitimacy. And every time the Enuma Elish was read aloud, the city's divine right was renewed. The text's preservation under the Kassites was not passive. Tablets from Nippur, Uruk, and Sippar reveal variant copies, some with subtle additions, signs of curated transmission, not rote copying. It is during this period that Marduk ascends fully to the top of the Mesopotamian pantheon, supplanting older deities like Enlil. The Kassites embraced Marduk, elevating him through liturgy and temple offerings. His great temple in Babylon, Esagila, received lavish support, its bricks stamped not only with Kassite king names, but inscriptions dedicating its rebuilding for the god who brings order. The second great work was the Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest heroic tale ever recorded. Though its earliest versions date to Sumerian times, it was during the Kassite era that the standard Babylonian version was compiled. This version introduced new episodes, deeper emotional structure, and the now iconic ending in which Gilgamesh, defeated by mortality, looks out across the city walls of Uruk and accepts human limitation. The Gilgamesh we remember today, the wanderer, the mourner, the king, was shaped by Kassite scribes, preserving a story that was already ancient and making it eternal. Rare tablets show that these texts were used not just for ritual but for education. In the Adubas, apprentice scribes copied lines from Enuma Elish and Gilgamesh as exercises in grammar, meaning and style. These works became the literary canon of Babylon, the measure of both piety and intellect. Even lesser-known hymns and prayers were recopied in this period, laments for ruined cities, invocations of healing deities, or dialogues between gods and men. The Kassite state maintained temple archives, inventories of offerings, and catalogues of incantations, preserving the voice of an age long past, not to modernize it, but to maintain its sanctity. One particularly rare find, a tablet from the Kassite temple of Gula, goddess of healing, includes both medical recipes and ritual prayers, reflecting a worldview in which the divine and the empirical were never separate. Kassite kings also introduced new cultic titles into temple administration, possibly drawn from their own Zagros heritage, yet they never displaced the old priesthoods. Instead, they interwove their rule with the sacred systems already in place. In many ways, the Kassites understood what their empire truly was: not a dominion of swords but of stories. Not a land to be rewritten, but a scroll to be read carefully, reverently, and in sequence. And so, through the turbulence of the late Bronze Age, Babylon endured not because it conquered but because it remembered. Its gods remained. Its myths still spoke. And its clay as ever endured the fire. The Kassite dynasty, Babylon's longest-lived, had preserved the city's soul for centuries. But no reign lasts forever. By the 12th century BCE, their grip had loosened. And from the east, an old enemy stirred once more: Elam. The Elamites, who dwelled in the mountainous lands of modern southwestern Iran, had grown bold. Their raids pierced deep into Mesopotamia. Their power extended across the Zagros. And in a final insult, sometime during the fall of the Kassite rule, they had stolen the statue of Marduk, Babylon's patron god. It was not just plunder. It was theft of identity. Without the image of Marduk, the rituals of kingship could not be completed. Without his presence, Babylon was spiritually disarmed. It would take a new king, one from Babylon itself, to bring him home. His name was Nebuchadnezzar I. He ruled in the early 12th century BCE, at the head of the second dynasty of Isin, a line that followed the Kassites but sought to reignite Babylonian pride. Unlike his later namesake, Nebuchadnezzar I is not remembered for building wonders but for something older and more primal: vengeance. Cuneiform chronicles, omen texts, and even royal hymns describe his campaigns against Elam as both military expeditions and sacred retribution. In inscriptions, he writes not only as king, but as agent of Marduk, divinely chosen to strike down the enemies of the gods. According to the Marduk prophecy, a poetic and politicized account, the Elamites had become arrogant, trusting in false omens. Their priests misread the signs. Their kings ignored divine warnings. And so Marduk, even in exile, summoned his avenger. In a series of lightning campaigns, Nebuchadnezzar I marched eastward. Babylonian troops crossed the Tigris, descended into Elamite-held territories, and struck at the heart of Susa, the Elamite capital. The texts say he returned with spoils, prisoners, and above all the statue of Marduk. He brought the god home. The scene, imagined now only through ritual texts and damaged annals, must have been extraordinary. Marduk's image, solemn and draped in gold, was carried in procession through the city gates. The crowds chanted. The priests wept. The temple drums thundered. For the first time in over a generation, Babylon belonged to itself again. Nebuchadnezzar I's triumph was more than military. It was theological repair. He restored the Asagila, Marduk's great temple. He re-established the Akita festival, once again reading the Enuma Elish aloud before the god in his rightful place. He declared himself, "He who made the face of Marduk to shine." Even centuries later, his victory would be remembered in hymns, copied by scribes and invoked by kings. To restore Marduk was to restore the cosmos. Rare surviving oracles suggest that even the omens had shifted after the campaign. Where once eclipses and comets signaled doom, now they were read as signs of divine favor. In the Babylonian worldview, balance had been restored. For a brief moment, Babylon stood whole again, not an empire, not yet a superpower, but something just as potent. A city with its God returned, its rituals complete, and its memory intact. Nebuchadnezzar I had brought Marduk home. For a brief, shining moment, Babylon stood upright again, her gods restored, her king exalted, her pride rekindled. But the light did not last. What followed was not a single fall, but a slow unraveling, an age not of glorious collapse, but of erosion lived day by day. By the late 12th century BCE, the political fabric of Mesopotamia began to fray. Babylon's enemies no longer came in armies with banners, they came in tribes, in migrants, in shadowy raiders whose names changed from decade to decade. Chief among them were the Arameans, nomadic pastoralists from the Syrian steppe, who swept into southern Mesopotamia in waves. They did not seek conquest. They brought no kings, no creeds. They brought instability. The Arameans carved the land into fragments. They disrupted canals, attacked convoys, and seized outlying towns. Babylonian scribes refer to these times with one haunting phrase: the land turned to dust. It was not just the Arameans. Other groups, Chaldeans, Sutu, and Pukedu, emerged in the southern marshes, forming loose tribal confederations that operated outside temple control. Power leaked from the center. Kings still sat on the throne of Babylon, but their names fade quickly in the chronicles, ephemeral reigns, one after another. Some ruled only a few years. Some were likely never crowned at Esagila at all, their authority more symbolic than sovereign. The record's thin. In some years there are no surviving tablets. Temples fall behind in offerings. Sacred processions are suspended. Entire cult centers go dark. One omen text from this time reads, "If the sun rises dim and the river floods early, the city will scatter. The gods will not answer." The canal systems, once the veins of the empire, were damaged by neglect and tribal conflict. Fields flooded or dried up. Grain stores shrank. In the absence of strong kings, even local priests and governors began carving out fiefdoms, temple cities acting as independent actors, bartering loyalties to survive. Babylon was not forgotten, but it was diminished. A city still sacred, still feared, but no longer the pulse of an empire. Its bricks still bore the names of old kings. But its voice had grown quiet. Travelers passing through would still speak of its temples, but also of empty streets. Of torchlight in shrines, but no crowds in the courtyards. Of kings who signed tablets, but did not rule. It was an age of half-light, when memories outshone the present. And though Babylon endured, it did so in fragments scattered across clay, ritual, and fading prayer. Babylon, for all her sacred fire and ancient pride, had grown fragile. Her kings were hesitant. Her gods were quiet. Her rivals, however, were not. To the north, where the Tigris runs faster and the hills rise like sentinels, another kingdom had stirred. Its name was Assyria. At first, Assyria had been Babylon's cultural cousin, born of the same Sumerian roots, worshipping many of the same gods, writing the same cuneiform on the same clay. But by the 10th century BCE, it had become something else. What Babylon whispered, Assyria shouted. Where Babylon relied on lineage and ritual, Assyria imposed itself through iron, walls, and war. Assyria had once been content with regional control, cities like Ashur, Nimrud, and Nineveh serving as its strongholds. But under kings like Ashurnasirpal II and later Tiglath-Pileser III, it evolved into a militarized machine, swift, systematic, and unsentimental. Their armies rode chariots trimmed in bronze, marched with siege towers and carved victory scenes into palace walls before the blood had dried. Their records were not just administrative, they were propaganda in stone. And yet, for all its might, Assyria looked south to Babylon, not only because of its land and wealth, but because of its legacy. Babylon, even weakened, still carried the cultural gravity of a holy city. To rule it was not just strategy, it was sanctification. To be king of Babylon was to inherit legitimacy in the eyes of the gods. The Assyrians began their encroachment not with war, but with presence. Royal marriages, military alliances, carefully worded treaties. Babylonian rulers, unable to match Assyrian strength, often invited Assyrian support to suppress rebellions, especially in the tribal south. One such Babylonian king, Nabushemarishkin, called upon Assyrian aid, only to find the help more permanent than expected. Assyrian generals stayed. Advisors lingered. Governors were appointed. A new kind of entanglement had begun, not conquest but infiltration. And slowly, inevitably, the balance shifted. Babylon, once the oracle of kings, now found herself answering to kings not her own. Yet Assyria did not seek to destroy her. Not yet. The priests still conducted rituals in Asagila. The Akita festival still echoed down processional way. But the old autonomy was gone. Babylon's crown grew lighter. Her decisions shared. A fragile coexistence emerged. Assyria and Babylon, bound together by geography, language, and religion, yet divided by power. The next century would see treaties broken, temples sacked, and cities burned not once but again and again. But for now, Babylon waited, caught between her memories and the looming certainty that her future would be written in northern hands. Babylon had long survived by memory, by lineage, ritual, and divine reputation. But Assyria, growing bolder by the decade, had begun to rewrite Babylon's story not through siege, but from within. By the 8th century BCE, Assyria was no longer just a power. It was an empire. Its kings no longer negotiated. They appointed. Its armies no longer paused at the Euphrates, they crossed it. The turning point came under Tiglath-Pileser III, one of the most formidable kings Assyria had ever produced. Ruthless, reformist, and tireless, he reorganized the empire into a centralized military state, and Babylon was suddenly not just a neighbor but a target. In 729 BCE, Tiglath-Pileser marched into Babylon not as invader, but as king. He crowned himself king of Sumer and Akkad, a title reserved for rulers of southern Mesopotamia. For the first time in history, the king of Assyria also ruled Babylon directly. But Babylon was not Assur, and its gods were not taken lightly. The Assyrian monarchs, sensing the spiritual weight of their southern prize, adapted with surprising care. They performed the Babylonian coronation rites, submitted to Marduk's authority, and even participated in the Akita festival, walking humbly before priests they outranked in every worldly sense. In a strange twist, conquest came cloaked in reverence. But not all Babylonians accepted this arrangement. Beneath the rituals, resentment festered. The scribes copied texts but added warnings in the margins. The priests spoke the litanies, but their silences grew longer. And then came the storm. Merodach-Baladan. A Chaldean tribal leader from the southern marshes, Merodach-Baladan was no temple-bred aristocrat. He was a frontier chieftain, a man of rough alliances and sharper ambition. But he spoke the language of Babylon's gods. He restored temples. He paid the priests. He carried himself not as rebel but as king. In 721 BCE, after the death of Shalmaneser V, Merodach-Baladan seized the throne of Babylon. His reign was not long, only a dozen years, but it shook the Assyrian order. For the first time in generations, Babylon had a ruler not imposed from the north. The people rallied. Processions returned. Clay tablets from this era use the phrase, Marduk has returned favor to his city. The Assyrians, of course, did not let it stand. In 710 BCE, Sargon II, father of the infamous Sennacherib, invaded and reclaimed Babylon. Merodach-Baladan fled first to the marshes, then to Elam, then back again. He would attempt to reclaim Babylon twice more, failing each time. But his legend never faded. To the Babylonians he became a symbol, not just of rebellion but of resistance with a righteous cause. A reminder that Babylon was not a province, it was a priesthood, a culture, a memory older than its conquerors. Even in exile, Merodach-Baladan continued to write letters, send envoys, and incite uprisings. Some of his correspondence preserved in Nineveh's archives shows him negotiating with Hezekiah of Judah, forming secret anti-Assyrian coalitions. The war had moved beyond armies. It was now being waged through politics, piety, and clay. And though the Assyrian kings would return, some with fire, others with gifts, they would never again possess Babylon without a fight. Babylon had resisted Assyria with rituals, alliances, and memory. But now came a king who had no patience for memory and no fear of gods. His name was Sennacherib, son of Sargon II, lord of Nineveh, master of siege and strategy. His armies had conquered cities from Judea to Cilicia. His roads cut across empires. But Babylon remained an open wound. The city had rebelled again. Merodach-Baladan's ghost still lingered, and new uprisings had taken hold. In 689 BCE, Sennacherib decided he would settle the question forever. He did not come to rule Babylon. He came to erase it. What followed was not a battle. It was a dismantling. Sennacherib's inscriptions carved with icy triumph tell the story. I destroyed, devastated, and burned with fire the city. I tore down its walls, its outer and inner ramparts. I destroyed the temples and gods within. I reduced the city and its people to shadows. The temples of Esagila and Etemenanke, sacred for centuries, were demolished stone by stone. Their remains, clay, brick, statues, holy vessels, were not left in place. Sennacherib ordered them dumped into the Euphrates, as if to wash Babylon from the earth itself. The river that had once nourished Babylon now swallowed its bones. It was not only buildings that were destroyed, it was cosmic order. In the Babylonian worldview, temples were not mere places of worship. They were anchors of the universe, where gods dwelled, where kings received legitimacy, and where the world was kept in balance through sacred rites. By tearing down Esagila, Sennacherib had unmade the Axis Mundi. Priests fled. Processions ceased. The Akitu festival, the heartbeat of Babylon's calendar, went silent. In one account preserved later, a Babylonian scribe laments, "The gods have abandoned their shrines. The oil is spilled. The breath of the city is gone." Sennacherib made no apologies. In Nineveh, he commissioned reliefs of his victories, scenes of siege, flames, and chains. He believed that Babylon had defied him one time too many. He even mocked the ritual language of Babylon in his tablets, calling Marduk's priests useless men with clay mouths. But the destruction sent shockwaves beyond mere politics. Even Assyrians were disturbed. Babylon was not just a city, it was part of their own shared spiritual heritage. Priests in Assur and Arbela whispered that Sennacherib had gone too far. That no mortal king, however powerful, could dismantle a god's house without cost. They were right. Just a few years later, in 681 BCE, Sennacherib was assassinated not by foreign enemies, but by his own sons. Some accounts say they struck him down in a temple, of final judgment from the very gods he had mocked. Babylon had been reduced to ash. But its destruction had left a void in the divine order, one that even Assyria could not ignore. And so the story of vengeance Babylon's and the gods was not yet over. The gods of Babylon had been defiled, their temples broken, their names mocked, their city, once the jewel of the southern plains, scattered like dust across the Euphrates. And then the sword fell. In 681 BCE, Sennacherib, king of Assyria, the man who had ordered Babylon's erasure, was murdered by his own sons. Not in battle, not on campaign, but in Ninurta's temple while he prayed. The timing was uncanny. The setting unmistakable. The symbolism divine. Babylonian chroniclers seized on the moment with theological clarity. To them this was not politics. It was judgment. Sennacherib had torn down the house of Marduk, and now he had been struck down in the house of another god. One later Babylonian text described the event with chilling precision. The hands of his own sons spilled his blood. The gods took vengeance for Babylon. Even among the Assyrians there was unease. Sennacherib's actions had disturbed the cosmic order. The destruction of Babylon had unbalanced the world. Into this spiritual vacuum stepped a new king, Esarhaddon, the youngest son of Sennacherib, but one who had not participated in the murder. In a stroke of political genius and religious humility, he positioned himself as the restorer, not the destroyer. He did not deny his father's crimes. He sought to atone for them. One of Esarhaddon's first royal acts was to order the rebuilding of Babylon, not just its walls, but its soul. His inscriptions read not like boasts but like confessions. I sought out the sacred plants. I rebuilt Babylon as it had been in ancient days. The reconstruction was slow, deliberate, and highly symbolic. He relaid the bricks of Asagila, the temple of Marduk, following ancient measurements inscribed on foundation tablets. He dredged the canals, reopened the processional way, and reinstated the Akita festival, which had lain dormant for nearly 2 decades. Clay cylinder texts from Esarhaddon's reign show him consulting priests, restoring shrines, and even importing pure clay from old sources to match the sacred materials once used. He did not simply rebuild Babylon, he re-sanctified it. In one extraordinary gesture, Esarhaddon proclaimed that any work done on Babylon must be done with clean hands and ritual fasting. Workers were ritually purified. Tools were blessed. Offerings were made at every stage of construction. It was as if he was not merely repairing a city but stitching a tear in the heavens. Assyrian court poets began calling him the shepherd who restored the broken city. Babylonian scribes, too, acknowledged his efforts cautiously but respectfully. A generation that had grown up with fire now watched stone return to stone. Esarhaddon's restoration was not merely a political maneuver. It was a symbolic act of repentance, an attempt to mend not only walls but divine trust. And in that trust, a fragile hope returned. The gods had been silenced, but now their voices were beginning once more to echo across the bricks. Esarhaddon had rebuilt the walls, soothed the priests, and offered sacrifices in the names of both Babylon and Assur. But he could not bind the hearts of his sons. In 672 BCE, sensing his time waning, Esarhaddon crafted a careful succession plan. His younger son, Ashurbanipal, would inherit the Assyrian throne in Nineveh. His older son, Shamash-Shemukhin, would rule over Babylon, its temples, its scholars, and its southern lands. 2 thrones. 1 empire. It was a vision of fraternal harmony, or perhaps a hope dressed as policy. For while the arrangement was announced with solemn oaths and witnessed by gods, its fault lines were immediate. Ashurbanipal, though younger, had been groomed in the core of Assyrian power. He commanded generals, scribes, and priests. Shamash-Shemukhin, though older, was sent south to Babylon, a city with sacred legacy but political volatility. From the moment their crowns were placed, tension simmered. The official inscriptions spoke of unity, but the archives tell another story. Clay letters between governors whisper of covert disputes, missed tributes, snubbed envoys. Babylon had long endured foreign kings, but now it had one of its own blood, a son of Esarhaddon, speaking Akkadian with native fluency, surrounded by loyal Babylonian elites. And as years passed, Shamash-Shum-Ukin began to see his role not as second, but as equal or perhaps even rightful heir to all Mesopotamia. By 652 BCE, the unspoken strain erupted into open rebellion. Shamash-Shum-Ukin declared war against his brother. His call to arms was more than personal, it was ideological. His tablets urged Babylon's allies to rise against Assyrian tyranny. He framed the conflict as holy resistance, the South reclaiming dignity from the iron grip of the North. Babylon became the heart of the storm. Armies gathered in her gates. Tribes from Elam and Chaldea sent warriors. Even some cities of the Levant sent tentative support. For 3 years war consumed the land. But Ashurbanipal, brilliant and cold, responded with force. He mobilized the full might of Assyria, not just its soldiers, but its spies, diplomats, and siege engines. Babylon held out. But Nineveh outmaneuvered. One by one, Shamash-Shum-Ukin's allies fell. Elam collapsed into civil war. His generals were outflanked. The city of Sippar betrayed him. By 648 BCE, the siege of Babylon began. For months, the city endured famine, disease, and chaos. Ashurbanipal's records describe the scene. The people ate the flesh of their sons and daughters. Pestilence walked the streets. Fire consumed the rest. When the gates fell, Shamash-Shum-Ukin did not beg. He did not flee. According to Assyrian accounts, he locked himself inside his palace, lit the halls with fire, and perished in the flames. A brother crowned in Babylon reduced to ash beneath his own roof. Babylon once again was punished. Temples were plundered, idols removed, walls torn down. And Ashurbanipal, victorious, wrote triumphantly but uneasily. He had defeated his brother. But in doing so, he had scorched his father's dream, and once more violated the soul of Babylon. Babylon had survived betrayal, invasion, starvation, and fire. She had been ruled by foreigners, abandoned by kings, and desecrated by empire. And yet she endured. By the late 7th century BCE, the Assyrian Empire, once the most powerful force in the known world, was crumbling. The capital at Nineveh still stood, but its foundations were hollow. Revolts flared across its provinces. Its gods, once feared from Egypt to Elam, now whispered to deaf ears. Into this vacuum rose a Babylonian warlord named Nabopolassar. Of Chaldean origin, born in the marshes of the south, Nabopolassar was no stranger to instability. He had seen the fall of kings, the betrayal of cities, and the hunger of an empire eating itself. But unlike past rebels, he saw the moment for what it was: not just a chance to escape Assyrian rule, but to replace it. In 626 BCE, Nabopolassar led a successful revolt in Babylon. The chronicles record it simply. In the month of Arisamna, the people of Babylon made Nabopolassar king. But what followed was not simple. Assyrian loyalists still held cities to the north. Governors resisted. Armies marched. For nearly a decade, Nabopolassar fought a brutal, grinding campaign against the remnants of Assyrian control, slowly peeling away fortress after fortress. In 616 BCE he marched on Nippur. In 615 he reached Assur's borderlands. But he did not stand alone. In a strategic masterstroke, Nabopolassar formed an alliance with the rising power of the Medes, whose king Cyaxares also sought to bring Assyria to its knees. Together, the Babylonians and the Medes became a two-headed hammer. In 614 BCE, they sacked Assur, the old spiritual capital of the empire. And then in 612 BCE they struck the heart, Nineveh. The siege lasted months. Walls fell. Gates burned. Ashurbanipal's palaces, once glittering with carved alabaster and libraries of knowledge, were torn down by fire and iron. A Babylonian soldier, anonymous in history, carved into a tablet. The city of arrogance is no more. The gods have returned justice. Assyria was not destroyed in a day. Its final remnants limped westward to Haran. But Nineveh's fall marked the end of its empire and the beginning of Babylon's rebirth. Nabopolassar returned to Babylon not as a rebel, but as a liberator and now an emperor. Temples were restored. Roads were paved. And the once hushed streets of Babylon again filled with chants, drums, scribes, and sacrifice. Nabopolassar had not only freed Babylon, he had avenged her. His reign marked the start of what would become Babylon's final golden age, an age his son would make even more dazzling. But for now the empire was his. And so, nearly 1,000 years after Hammurabi, Babylon once again ruled Mesopotamia not as a client, not as a symbol, but as the heart of the world. Nabopolassar had broken the back of Assyria. But it would be his son who carved Babylon's name into eternity. His name was Nebuchadnezzar II. His titles: King of Babylon, King of the lands, the restorer of Esagila and Ezida, the avenger of Marduk, echoed from Egypt to Elam. When Nebuchadnezzar ascended the throne in 605 BCE, Babylon was a city of revival but not yet of dominion. It would be his task to transform it into the imperial heart of the ancient world. And he would begin with war. The Assyrian vacuum had left fractured kingdoms in its wake. Egypt sought to dominate the Levant. Judah, Tyre, Arpad, and others wavered in allegiance. Nebuchadnezzar moved quickly. In his very first year as king, he met Pharaoh Necho II at Carchemish, on the banks of the Euphrates, a final echo of Egypt's hopes to reclaim western lands. The Babylonian Chronicle records it in stark clarity. Nebuchadnezzar crossed the river and inflicted a defeat upon them. Egypt turned and fled. With Egypt humbled, he turned westward. From Syria to Judah, from the Phoenician coast to the desert fortresses, city after city fell under Babylonian authority. His sieges were not just military, they were statements. To resist Babylon was to defy the gods. To submit was to join the order of Marduk. In Jerusalem, resistance brought destruction. Biblical texts recall how Nebuchadnezzar laid siege to the city, exiled its king, and carried away sacred objects to Babylon. But Babylonian records, notably the Babylonian ration lists, mention the Judean king Jehoiakim not as a prisoner, but as a resident of status, granted rations in the royal household. Even in Conquest, Nebuchadnezzar calculated legacy. Yet he was not merely a warrior. He returned from war to build, to design, to shape a city that would reflect the order of heaven on earth. His inscriptions do not dwell on enemies. They dwell on brick and mortar, cedar and gold, temples and gates. He rebuilt the massive Etemenanke ziggurat, the fabled Tower of Babel, as it would later be imagined. He restored Esagila, the temple of Marduk, laying its foundations with ritually pure bricks, calling himself the favored shepherd of the gods. He commissioned the Ishtar Gate, a portal of blue-glazed brick, lined with dragons and bulls, a celestial welcome to the inner sanctum of Babylon. Its inscription reads, "I placed wild bulls and dragons in awe upon its gates, to strike terror into all who behold them." No detail was too small. Nebuchadnezzar reinforced canals, built roads, expanded walls, and engineered flood defenses that remain buried beneath modern Baghdad. Babylon became not just a capital but a cosmos in stone. Foreign scribes would remember him as a destroyer, Babylonian ones remembered him as a king-priest, a builder of temples, a renewer of civilization. And he remembered himself in every inscription, every statue, every scroll as a man caught between the sword and the brick. Nebuchadnezzar too would reign for over 4 decades. And in that time he made Babylon not only the greatest city of the Bronze and Iron Ages but a name that would echo through prophecy, poetry, and prophecy for millennia. Victory made Nebuchadnezzar powerful, but building made him eternal. In the heart of Mesopotamia, along the shifting currents of the Euphrates, he laid out a vision not just of strength, but of divine order made visible. His kingdom would not only be ruled, it would be engineered into perfection. Babylon under Nebuchadnezzar became a masterpiece of urban design. It wasn't just large, it was orchestrated, with each element speaking to the heavens. At its entrance rose the most famous gate of the ancient world, the Ishtar Gate, 40 feet high, faced in cobalt blue glazed bricks. And upon those walls danced hundreds of mythical beasts, Mushusha dragons, sacred to Marduk, and aurochs, bulls of the storm god Adad. These were not painted. They were molded, fired, and set into relief, giving the gate a living presence. Above the arch, a dedicatory inscription in cuneiform reads, "I, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, made this gateway with blue stone to make all people gaze upon it in wonder." The gate marked the beginning of the processional way, a wide, paved avenue nearly half a mile long, flanked by high walls and lined with thousands of glazed bricks. This was the route walked by kings, priests, and statues of the gods during the Akita festival, when divine presence descended to bless the year. The street was not merely ceremonial. It was calculated, precisely leveled, meticulously adorned, and engineered to handle the weight of the cultic processions. Some of its bricks are stamped, still, with Nebuchadnezzar's name. And at the far end of the processional way, one arrived at the Asagila, the temple of Marduk, Babylon's divine patron. This was no humble shrine. It was a sacred machine, calibrated to channel celestial will. Asagila's inner sanctum, the Iker Igigalum, was layered in gold and cedar, with massive stone thresholds shipped from distant lands. The cella housed the cult statue of Marduk, said to be so lifelike, priests feared to meet its gaze without purification. Around it, Nebuchadnezzar built courts, storerooms, and scribe halls, all aligned by astronomical orientation. Offerings were laid daily. Rituals followed mathematical precision. And rising beside Asagila stood the Edamananki, the famed ziggurat, 7 tiers of mud brick and bitumen reaching an estimated height of 91 meters, 300 feet. Its name meant, House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth. Though its earlier foundations predated Nebuchadnezzar, it was he who fully rebuilt and clad it in fired brick. Travelers from Persia to Greece would later stand in its shadow and whisper of Babel. Nebuchadnezzar's building inscriptions read less like royal declarations and more like invocations. May my name be remembered in Asagila forever. I built with love, with reverence, with hands purified by water. The scale is hard to imagine even today. Babylon's double walls stretched for miles, the outermost wide enough to allow chariots to ride 4 abreast. Canals, bridges, and reservoirs flowed through the city in engineered harmony. No single empire had done more to turn cosmology into city planning. Babylon had become not just a city of kings but a reflection of the heavens, built in brick, bronze, and divine geometry. Babylon was not merely a city of temples and towers. It was a city of ritual, of time made sacred, of power made humble, of divinity made visible. And no ritual was more profound than the Akita festival. Celebrated each year at the spring equinox, Akita marked the new year not with fireworks, but with cosmic alignment. The gods were invited to descend. Chaos was ritually defeated. Kingship was renewed. But for the king it was not a time of comfort. For amid the drums, chants, and garlands of flowers, came a ritual unlike any in the ancient world. The humiliation of the king before Marduk. On the 5th day of Akitu, the ruler of Babylon was led alone into the inner sanctum of Assyria. There before the high priest he removed his crown, his scepter, his sword, all symbols of his power. The priest then spoke solemnly, reciting an ancient formula. Do not be angry with the city of Babylon. Do not be angry with your temple. Do not turn away your face. The king responded with a prayer of contrition, reaffirming his unworthiness to rule without the god's favor. And then came the moment of reckoning. The priest slapped the king's cheek hard. And then again. If the king's eyes filled with tears, it was taken as a sign. Marduk has accepted the king's humility. Babylon is safe. The man who had conquered cities, who had built towers into the clouds, stood powerless, weeping, bruised, and waiting for divine acceptance. Only then could his crown be restored. Only then could the festival continue with parades, hymns, feasts, and rituals reenacting Marduk's cosmic victory over Tiamat, the dragon of chaos. For 11 days, Babylon became a theater of myth, a place where gods walked among men, where statues were paraded on golden boats, and where past, present, and eternity folded into one. The Akita festival was not a celebration of triumph alone. It was a reminder that kingship was a burden, a contract, and a sacred responsibility. Nebuchadnezzar too, like his predecessors, submitted to this rite every year. Not because he lacked authority but because he understood its source. In Babylon, power was not seized. It was granted by the gods, through humility and through ritual renewal. And thus, Babylon remained whole not only by walls and armies, but by the tears of its king. The king had submitted himself before Marduk in ritual. But Babylon's true balance of power ran deeper than festival pageantry. It was written in ledgers, counted in grain, stamped on clay. At the heart of Babylon's state was not just the palace but the temple. And at the center of the temple stood the priesthood of Marduk. Assyria, the temple complex of the god, was more than a house of worship. It was a bureaucratic engine, the largest landholder in Babylon, the wealthiest employer, and the silent partner in every royal decision. Priests controlled vast tracts of agricultural land, leased out for cultivation. They employed thousands from field laborers to scribes, herdsmen, bakers, and artisans. Temple storehouses brimmed with grain, oil, dates, wool, and silver, tracked meticulously on cuneiform tablets. These weren't offerings. They were revenue. The Satamu, temple administrator, and the Sangu, chief priest, wielded enormous influence, often acting as intermediaries between the gods and the king, but also between the state and the economy. In some years, temple estates produced more income than royal lands, and were exempt from palace taxation. And while the king appointed many high-ranking clergy, his choices were shaped by politics, tradition, and divine consultation. The temples didn't just bless kings. They confirmed them. Without the priesthood's support, without the statue of Marduk consenting in ritual, no Babylonian ruler could claim legitimacy. In return, kings showered temples with privilege, tax exemptions, labor allocations, and vast ceremonial donations of cattle, incense, and gold. Nebuchadnezzar too alone issued dozens of royal inscriptions detailing offerings, to gladden the heart of Marduk. But this relationship was not passive. It was a negotiation, constantly shifting, sometimes cooperative, sometimes contentious. In periods of instability, the temple could become the center of resistance, safeguarding tradition when kings faltered or foreigners imposed themselves. Even during foreign rule, Assyrian, Persian, or Hellenistic, the priesthood remained intact, adapting without surrendering its theological core. They were the keepers of time, of writing, of ritual. They trained the scribes, preserved the myths, and interpreted the omens by which decisions of state were made. In Babylon, power was not just martial, it was spiritual, economic, and intellectual. And the priesthood stood at the crossroads of all three. As the city expanded in grandeur, its foundations remained tied to a sagala not only in brick and prayer, but in ledgers, tablets, and quiet influence. The king may have worn the crown, but Marduk's voice and his earthly agents always had the final word. Behind the walls of Babylon, beyond the gates and gardens, beneath the temples and towers, a quieter miracle was unfolding. A civilization was thinking, and writing, and measuring the heavens. The grandeur of Babylon was not just in its architecture or armies, but in its libraries. In its scribes, who trained from childhood to see the universe not as mystery, but as a system to be read, recorded, and interpreted. This was a city of clay, and every piece of clay could hold an idea. In the temple schools called Edubba, House of Tablets, students were drilled daily in Sumerian and Akkadian, in arithmetic and metrology, in ritual and lexicon. Their tools? A reed stylus, a board of wet clay, and memory sharpened by repetition. The scribes were not mere copyists. They were engineers of thought, maintaining the operating system of Mesopotamian civilization. Without them, no law could be written. No ritual could be kept. No calendar could be trusted. At the height of its scholarly culture, Babylon housed thousands of cuneiform tablets across temple complexes and royal palaces, arranged by subject, copied for generations, and annotated in the margins with scholarly debates. Their topics? Astronomy, mathematics, omens, medicine, agriculture, ritual, exorcism, grammar, law, divination. In the Asagala temple library, priest-scribes worked with astonishing precision. They charted the paths of Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and the Moon with such consistency that Babylonian astronomers could predict eclipses centuries in advance. The Enuma Anu Enlil, a 70-tablet series, catalogued thousands of celestial omens. If Venus disappears in the west and remains invisible for 3 days, the king of Akkad will be secure. Their logic may seem foreign, yet it was data-rich, empirically compiled, and systematized over 500 years. No civilization in the Bronze Age tracked the skies with such obsession. Babylonian astronomers used a sexagesimal, base 60, system, a numerical method so efficient that it still echoes today in 360 degrees of a circle, 60 minutes, and 60 seconds. They invented zigzag functions to approximate planetary motion, a forerunner to calculus. They recorded delta times between lunar risings and settings, a concept that wouldn't appear again until the Renaissance. In mathematics, they used tablets like YBC 7289, which encodes a near-exact square root of 2 to 4 decimal places, and BM 40054, which solves quadratic equations millennia before modern algebra. And then there was Emule.app, the comprehensive star catalog used by temple astronomers. It listed the heliacal risings of stars, divided the sky into constellations, and connected celestial events with agricultural and ritual calendars. These were not abstract studies. They guided planting, prophecy, royal policy, and temple ritual. Babylon's scholars weren't divided into priests and scientists, they were both. To read the stars was to read the will of the gods. To calculate a ratio was to preserve harmony in the cosmos. Their medicine blended incantation with pharmacopoeia. Their divination mixed statistics with theology. Their linguistics preserved dead languages alongside contemporary dialects. And throughout it all, the tablet endured. Written in cuneiform, pressed onto wet clay, baked or sun-dried and filed by topic, these texts formed the longest-running literary and scientific tradition in the ancient world. One Babylonian scribe even noted on a tablet, May future scholars not be negligent, but copy faithfully and preserve what is true. Even as empires rose and fell, the scribes of Babylon remained quiet, tireless, precise. When Alexander the Great entered the city centuries later, he found priests still keeping celestial logs using methods older than his own language. Babylon's libraries would later seed those of Nineveh, of Uruk, and even distant Hellenistic cities. Its scribal system would influence Aramaic bookkeeping, Persian astronomy, and Greek mathematical theory. For in Babylon, to write was not just to record, it was to remember, to command, to reach across time. It was the closest a mortal could come to divine permanence. The stars had been tracked. The omens read. The rituals concluded. But for most of Babylon's people, life unfolded not in temples or observatories but in the rhythm of the streets, the clamor of the markets, and the intimacy of home. Babylon was not just the stage for kings and priests. It was a metropolis teeming with craftsmen, merchants, farmers, laborers, scribes, slaves, and families. By the Neo-Babylonian period, it was likely the largest city in the world, with estimates ranging from 100,000 to 200,000 people, a population density comparable to medieval London. And yet it worked. The city's layout followed a logic of both sacred geometry and practical urban design. A vast network of canals and reservoirs regulated water from the Euphrates, supplying homes, irrigating fields, and powering mills. Major avenues like the Processional Way were wide and ceremonial, but most streets were narrow, shaded corridors, winding through dense residential blocks. Mud brick houses stood 2 to 3 stories tall, with inner courtyards, flat rooftops, and lattice windows. Some homes had private wells, latrines, and ovens. Noise was constant, a mix of donkeys, hawkers, musicians, temple bells, and construction. And the smells? A swirl of baking bread, burning incense, date beer, human sweat, and livestock. At the heart of the city pulsed its markets, both permanent and itinerant. Babylon sat at the crossroads of empires, and its bazaars reflected that reach. Timber from the Levant, copper from Oman, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, incense from Arabia, grain and wool from the Babylonian countryside. Market stalls sold onions, lentils, dates, barley bread, fermented fish, beer, oil, and textiles. Silver shekels served as standard currency, but barter remained common. Legal tablets record contracts for slaves, donkeys, boats, homes, fields, marriages, and divorces, each sealed with names, witnesses, and dates. A Babylonian shopper could haggle, pledge collateral, or even take disputes to a local court, often held under temple authority. Each neighborhood had its local shrine, but the spiritual gravity remained at Esagila, the temple of Marduk. Here the elite priesthood oversaw daily sacrifices, usually sheep, bulls, and birds, libations of oil and beer, incantations against illness or curses, astrological calculations for choosing dates of war, marriage, or harvest. Festivals were constant, over 100 holy days per year. Drums, flutes, hymns, masked dances, feasting. On those days even the poor received temple rations, beer, oil, and bread. But for some, faith was not joyous, it was desperate. They came clutching amulets, asking for healing, crying before statues. A Babylonian exorcist, the Asipo, could recite a 1,000-year-old incantation and prescribe both prayer and poultices. And in the shadow of the ziggurat, astrologers cast horoscopes from tablets and stars, not just for kings, but for ordinary citizens. Babylon's workshops were the hum of its economy. Metalworkers smelted bronze and iron into tools and weapons. Weavers crafted dyed wool garments and fine linen for elite households. Potters made both utilitarian jugs and painted votive offerings. Builders laid fired brick using tools with designs unchanged for centuries. Many workers were free men, but others were debt-bound or enslaved, captured in war or sold through hardship. Their contracts appear in clay archives, listing duties, wages, or lack thereof, and conditions. Some slaves worked in households, others in temples. A few, especially scribes or stewards, even rose to high positions, a reminder of the system's complexity. At home, family life was structured but diverse. Households included parents, children, servants, and often extended relatives. Babylonian women could own property, inherit land, and initiate divorce, especially in the upper classes. Children began scribal training young if male and wealthy, or learned trades from their fathers. Girls learned domestic tasks, though temple priestesses and beer brewers were not uncommon. Night fell with oil lamps. The city cooled. Rooftops filled with talk, food, and stargazing. And through all of this, the trade, the prayer, the toil, Babylon endured. Its clay walls absorbed the footsteps of generations. Its temples echoed with voices reciting texts older than any living memory. Its ziggurat remained a symbol not just of architecture, but of aspiration. Babylon was not a place frozen in myth. It breathed, it hummed, it sweated. It was not just the city of Marduk. It was the city of human ambition, caught between heaven and earth, between the ordinary and the eternal. After the brilliance of Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon did not fall, but it trembled. The city still stood, its gates gleaming, its temples filled with offerings. But beneath the gold, the foundation had cracked. His successors, weak, short-lived, often murdered, failed to command the same divine aura. Babylon had become an empire too large for its kings, and too sacred to be ruled by mere men. Then came Nabonidus, a man unlike any Babylonian king before him. He did not emerge from the traditional Mardukite priestly families, nor was he a military hero in the mold of past conquerors. Instead, he was a scholar, a mystic, a self-styled restorer of ancient faiths. He claimed visions. He spoke of dreams. And he had a mission: to restore the worship of Sin, the ancient moon god of Haran. In a city where Marduk was king of the gods, this was heresy. From the moment he ascended the throne in 556 BCE, Nabonidus began reordering the cosmos. He elevated Sin above Marduk in official inscriptions. He poured resources into temples in Haran and Tema, rather than Esagila. He openly criticized Babylonian rituals, claiming they had fallen into impiety and error. And most shocking of all, he neglected the Akita festival, the sacred rite that renewed Babylon's divine order each year. The people noticed. The priests fumed. And the gods, many believed, turned their faces away. Then, in the 10th year of his reign, Nabonidus did the unthinkable. He left Babylon. Abandoning his royal capital, he withdrew to the oasis of Tema, in northern Arabia, a caravan hub foreign to Babylonian tradition. There, for a decade, he ruled in absentia, building temples to Sin, issuing edicts, and dispatching envoys. But to the people of Babylon, it was as if the king had vanished into the desert, taking the gods with him. In his absence, power passed to his son, Belshazzar, known from the book of Daniel, though they're called a king. Belshazzar tried to maintain order, but without his father's presence and without Marduk's blessing, his authority felt thin. Within Babylon, the Marduk priesthood seethed. They wrote bitter laments on clay. He disturbed the worship of the gods, he changed the rites, he forgot the festivals. Temple income plummeted. Ritual cycles broke. The cosmic balance, the tightly ordered wheel of gods and kings, began to spin off course. Some priests began to quietly reach out. To distant powers. To rising leaders in the east. And what of Nabonidus? He left behind inscriptions that read more like sermons than royal boasts. He spoke of dreams, of divine judgment, of his own chosen status by Sin. He commissioned one of the first royal restorations of ancient Mesopotamian buildings, digging to the foundations of temples to recover and preserve old inscriptions. He was, in his way, a historian king, obsessed with the past, suspicious of the present. But Babylon was not his to remake. His absence created a vacuum. And through that vacuum came a wind swift, foreign, and final. The fall of Babylon did not come with fire and ruin. It came with ritual silence, with gates unlocked, and with a foreign king speaking the language of the gods. By 539 BCE, Babylon was a city suspended between memory and unease. Nabonidus had alienated the priesthood, the military, and the people. He was still in Tema. His son Belshazzar ruled in his name, but Marduk's voice was quiet. The Akita festival had not been properly celebrated in over a decade. The high priests of Asagila, once loyal defenders of the throne, now looked elsewhere for order. That order came from the east. Cyrus II of Persia, king of Anshan, had already forged an empire. He had conquered Media, humbled Lydia, and absorbed Elam. Now he turned to Mesopotamia not with brutality but with strategy. He knew Babylon was religiously fractured, politically vulnerable, and weary of its own leadership. And so, instead of invading, he liberated. According to the Nabonidus Chronicle and corroborated by the Cyrus Cylinder, the moment came in October 539 BCE. General Gobrias, Gabaru, a Median under Cyrus' command, entered Babylon without resistance. The gates, opened, not breached. The walls, silent, not bloodied. Without battle he entered Babylon. The weapons of the great army were not drawn. He took the city in peace. Babylonian Chronicle of Nabonidus. Nabonidus was captured. Belshazzar vanished from the record. And Cyrus with deliberate calculation did not destroy. He restored. Within weeks, Cyrus issued one of the most extraordinary proclamations of the ancient world. Inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform on a barrel-shaped clay artifact, it survives today as the Cyrus Cylinder. I am Cyrus, king of the world, great king, mighty king, king of Babylon, king of Sumer and Akkad. When I entered Babylon in peace, I did not allow the terror to overwhelm the people. I restored the temples. I returned the sacred images to their sanctuaries. Marduk, the great lord, rejoiced in my deeds. Cyrus did not impose Persian religion. Instead, he reaffirmed Marduk's supremacy, claiming that the Babylonian god had personally chosen him to correct Nabonidus' sins. This was not just flattery. It was genius diplomacy. He reinstituted the Akita festival, restored temple funding, and allowed exiled peoples including the Judeans to return to their homelands. The priesthood, once guardians of national identity, now hailed a foreign king as Babylon's savior. Babylon had not burned. Its ziggurats still stood. Its temples rang again with hymns. But something had changed not in bricks but in sovereignty. Babylon would never again rule as an empire. It had become a jewel in a larger imperial crown, first Persian, then Macedonian, then Seleucid. Yet through Cyrus' conquest, Babylon's identity was preserved, not erased. The cylinder ends not with conquest but with hope. May all the gods I return to their cities pray for me before Bel and Nabu, for long life and good health. Cyrus had not only taken Babylon. He had inherited its soul. When Cyrus the Great entered Babylon, he bowed to Marduk, restored temples, and spoke the language of the land. But after him came rulers who saw Babylon not as sacred but strategic. A gem to be taxed, a land to be watched. Not a city of gods, but a city to govern. In the early years of Achaemenid rule, Babylon retained a unique prestige. It was one of the empire's 4 royal capitals, alongside Susa, Ecbatana, and Persepolis. The city's temple archives continued to operate, tax collection persisted, and Babylonian scribes were employed by the new regime. Persian kings Cambyses, Darius I, even Xerxes were officially titled King of Babylon, King of the lands. But the veneer of autonomy soon wore thin. In 522 BCE, amid political chaos after the death of Cambyses II, multiple uprisings broke out across the empire. Babylon proud, restless rebelled. A usurper named Nebuchadnezzar III seized the city and declared himself king, evoking the name of the great Nebuchadnezzar II. The Persian response was swift. Darius I, newly crowned, crushed the rebellion. But Babylon rose again, almost immediately, this time under Nebuchadnezzar IV. This pattern of local rulers reviving ancient royal names to legitimize rebellion terrified the Persians. A man named Araka, an Armenian, rose in Babylon. He lied, saying, "I am Nebuchadnezzar, son of Nabonidus." Darius I behissed an inscription. Both rebels were executed. Their supporters impaled. The city punished. But the symbolism was clear. Babylon had not forgotten empire. And Persia would not tolerate remembrance. To prevent further uprisings, Darius introduced systemic changes. He appointed Persian officials known as satraps to oversee taxation, law enforcement, and temple revenues. Babylon's landholding families were weakened, their estates reclassified as crown property. Temple autonomy, once a pillar of Mesopotamian politics, was gradually curtailed. Darius did, however, maintain some reverence for local tradition. He funded repairs to the Assyrian temple and allowed local religious rites to continue under supervision. But trust was broken, and it would not return. With the accession of Xerxes I, 486 BCE, Babylon's fragile status collapsed entirely. In his second year, another rebellion erupted, the third in less than 40 years. This time, Xerxes responded not with policy but punishment. He stripped Babylon of its title as royal capital. The title King of Babylon was removed from royal inscriptions. From then on, Persian kings would be King of Persia and the lands. Xerxes confiscated vast temple wealth, including gold from Assyria, an act seen as desecration. He likely ordered the partial demolition of the Etemenanke ziggurat, the Tower of Babel, though archaeological evidence is debated. From this point forward, Babylon was no longer exceptional. It became a normal province, watched closely, taxed heavily, honored never. The scribes still wrote. The priests still chanted. But the magic was thinning. Even as Babylon retained its size and population, its spiritual and political authority waned. It was now a subject city used, not revered. Foreign kings had once dreamed of ruling Babylon. Now they dreamed only of controlling it. By the time Alexander of Macedon crossed into Mesopotamia, Babylon was already a shadow of its former self. Its temples still rose toward heaven. Its scribes still recorded the stars. But its pride, once carved into every tablet and sung in every ritual, had been subsumed by centuries of foreign rule. Yet when Alexander entered Babylon in 331 BCE, the city stirred again. After defeating Darius III at the Battle of Gaugamela, Alexander marched triumphantly into Babylon not as a destroyer, but as a dreamer. The city's gates swung open in welcome. There were no battles. No sieges. No looting. Instead, Babylon's priests, nobles, and artisans lined the roads in procession, offering gifts and incense, chants and hymns. Alexander prostrated himself at Assyria, the temple of Marduk, and restored privileges lost under the Persians. He immediately funded repairs to temples, walls, and canals, declaring Babylon the administrative capital of his Eastern Empire. "This is where empires begin," he is said to have whispered to a companion, "and where gods walk among men." He commissioned the restoration of the Etemenanke ziggurat, known as the Tower of Babel, which had long been damaged and neglected. Babylon, for a brief moment, felt reborn not in war but in vision. But visions, like empires, are fragile. In June 323 BCE, barely 32 years old, Alexander fell ill in the very heart of Babylon. The location is believed to be the palace once built by Nebuchadnezzar II, a symbolic resting place for the last great conqueror. Over 10 days his condition worsened. Babylonian astronomical diaries describe. On the 29th of the month, the king's condition was very bad. On the 30th, the king was speechless. On the 1st of the next month, the king died. Greek sources differ in cause: malaria, typhoid, poisoning, but Babylonian scribes simply recorded his silence. And with it, the silence of hope. Alexander left behind no heir, only a half-born son and generals hungry for power. The city that had once ruled the known world became a pawn in the successor wars, a brutal civil conflict between his most trusted commanders, Seleucus, Antigonus, Perdiccas, Ptolemy, and others. Babylon was seized, lost, and seized again. In 316 BCE, Seleucus I Nicator ultimately prevailed, making Babylon the eastern base of the new Seleucid Empire. But even he did not stay long. Just a few decades later, Seleucus founded Seleucia on the Tigris, a new city downstream, draining Babylon of merchants, priests, scholars, and memory. Babylon had once welcomed Alexander as a savior. But in the end it buried him. And then, it buried itself. Cuneiform tablets continued to be written in Babylon until the 1st century CE, many of them lamenting the loss of rituals, funding, and temple authority. Priests wrote not in defiance but in remembrance. By the time Roman and Parthian envoys passed the ruins, they called it a haunted place, sacred but silent. The last lines of Babylon's story were not written in fire, but in forgetting. Babylon, once the gravitational center of gods and kings, now stood in the shadow of something new. Not a new deity. Not a conqueror. But a city designed not to remember but to replace. In the early 3rd century BCE, the Seleucid Empire, forged from the fractured world of Alexander's successors, made a decisive move. Seleucus I Nicator, now master of Mesopotamia, founded a new city along the banks of the Tigris. Seleucia on the Tigris, a Greek city in name, layout, and purpose. Unlike Babylon's organic maze of alleyways and courtyards, Seleucia was geometric, symmetrical, and Hellenistic in spirit. Streets intersected at clean angles. Theaters, gymnasia, and colonnades framed the city. It was a capital built for a new order, one where Greek-speaking elites governed the East, and memory bowed to utility. But Babylon did not vanish overnight. Its temples at Sagila, Adamananke still functioned. Its scribes still pressed cuneiform into wet clay. Its priests still recited the ancient hymns of Marduk. Yet something had shifted. Temple records from this period, especially from the Borsippa archives, begin to reflect a thinning of activity. Fewer donations. Fewer festivals. Fewer names. A famous temple inventory tablet from the mid-3rd century BCE notes. On the New Year's Day there was no procession. The priest remained indoors. The god was not taken out. This was not desecration. It was disinterest. Hellenistic travelers still visited Babylon. Some were awed. Others confused. One visitor, the geographer Polybius, described Babylon in the 2nd century BCE as mostly deserted, though of astonishing size. Another, Pliny the Elder, later claimed that only ruins remained, and the rest had been transferred to Seleucia. Seleucia became what Babylon once was: a hub of administration, a node of commerce, a magnet for migration. Archaeological evidence shows that many artisans, scribes, and priests from Babylon were relocated or voluntarily moved to Seleucia by the end of the 3rd century BCE. The Seleucid state redirected river traffic and trade routes toward its new capital. Babylon, once a crossroad of the world, found itself on the shoulder of history. The final centuries of Babylon's temple activity reveal a poignant struggle. Cuneiform continued to be taught but mostly to preserve rituals, not power. The temple economy limped on, fueled by legacy, not patronage. Priests still honored Marduk but fewer worshippers gathered in his name. Some texts from this period include long-winded curses against those who neglected ritual. Others beg for divine mercy as the festivals dwindled. Babylon had not been conquered again. It had simply been outgrown. Babylon, once the beating heart of Mesopotamia, had already faded from the map. No longer a center of empire, no longer a beacon of power or pride. Yet, it lingered in the silence of scribes, in the dust of forgotten temples, and in the rhythm of the stars. Even as Babylon's grandeur waned under foreign rule, its astronomical tradition endured. In the absence of kings, the priests of Marduk continued their work, if only in the shadows of a dying empire. Babylonian astronomical diaries kept on clay tablets and passed down by a dwindling cadre of scribes continued well into the 2nd century BCE. These were not just records of celestial events. They were guides to the cosmos, predicting eclipses, tracking the movements of planets and marking ominous portents. The star calendars still charted the heavens. Lunar eclipses were meticulously noted, with accurate predictions centuries ahead of their time. The Emuel.Appin series, a collection of astronomical texts, continued to be referenced, even as Seleucid and Parthian rule imposed new ways of thinking about the stars. One such tablet, dated 75 BCE, records, "The moon did not rise. The stars were hidden in darkness. A sign of misfortune." This entry, unearthed by modern archaeologists, reflects the continued importance of celestial omens long after Babylon had ceased to be the political capital of Mesopotamia. Despite the political eclipse of Babylon, astronomy continued to dominate its intellectual life, forming a bridge between the ancient world and the intellectual systems that would follow in later empires. The last cuneiform tablets written in Babylon date from the 1st century BCE, a reminder of the city's intellectual resilience. Some of these tablets, discovered in the ruins of the Asagila temple complex and nearby residential areas, show ritual prayers, mathematical calculations, and astronomical observations that reflect a deep reverence for Babylon's cultural past. A tablet found in a residential area near the Etemenanke ziggurat records a simple transaction. In the 11th year of King Seleucus, a clay tablet was bought by Aradbel. Its purpose, an offering for the gods of the temple. This humble record of purchase for a ritual offering underscores the importance of Babylon's spiritual traditions. Despite foreign conquest and decline, religious continuity persisted. Small sacrifices were still made, small rituals still observed. The gods, though quiet, were still honored. Though most scribal schools had long since left Babylon for Seleucia the Tigris or Ctesiphon, evidence of the last few scribes in the city remains in fragments of tablets, detailing lessons learned by young students in the temples of Marduk. These texts show how, in the twilight of Babylon's history, its scribal tradition had become less focused on the practical keeping accounts, managing property, and more focused on preserving the old knowledge of the gods and the stars. A tablet from 50 BCE mentions a student copying out the Enuma Elish, the creation myth of Marduk, which had once been recited yearly at the Akita festival. The scribe writes in long, careful lines, "It is not for the king. It is for the gods." This dedication to preserving Babylon's legacy despite everything highlights a profound cultural shift. The scribes were no longer recording the events of kings. Instead, they were preserving the stories of a city that had faded from history's grasp. The Asagila temple, though largely ignored by the ruling Seleucid and Parthian elites, remained a center of cultural resistance. Priests, though few, still performed the rituals even if the crowds no longer came. The great statues of Marduk and Nabu, once paraded through Babylon's streets during the Akita festival, were now locked away in the temple, forgotten by most. But the priests still offered incense, still recited prayers, though in a more quiet, personal way. By the end of the 2nd century BCE, Babylon had become a ghost of its former self, a city that had once commanded the attention of kings, but now buried beneath layers of sand and history. The city had ceased to be a political center, but its intellectual life, though diminished, survived in small pockets. Babylon's fate unfolded not with a dramatic fall, but with a slow, silent decline. Like the stars it had once tracked, Babylon faded from the sky, leaving only a legacy of tables and omens, rituals and prayers, knowledge carved in clay. The last known scribal work from Babylon was a simple astronomical record, made on July 22, 75 BCE, which noted, "The stars aligned. The moon rose clear and full." It was a small, quiet final chapter for a city that had once written the grandest tales in the world. As the centuries wore on and Babylon ceased to be the physical capital of empires, it remained a symbol, a myth, a lesson. Babylon was no longer a place, it became a legend, passed down through Greek scholars, biblical prophets, and Islamic historians, each adding layers of interpretation, wonder, and distortion. For the Greeks, Babylon was an awe-inspiring place, a gateway to the East filled with splendor and mystique. As they encountered Babylon's ruins, Greek writers and historians sought to frame the city's grandeur through a mythic lens, making the real fantastical. One of the earliest Greek accounts comes from Herodotus, who described Babylon in the 5th century BCE, marveling at the city's walls and the temples. The walls of Babylon were so broad that 2 chariots could race alongside one another on top. Though this was likely an exaggeration, Herodotus' writings, like many Greek works, embellished reality. His description of Babylon's breathtaking Ishtar Gate, dazzling blue and adorned with lions, bulls, and dragons, was mythologized over time, often blending fact with fiction. Herodotus also mentioned bizarre customs, such as ritual prostitution and burying the dead in honey, details that modern historians treat with caution due to their sensationalized nature. Nonetheless, Greek fascination with Babylon remained strong for centuries, and writers like Strabo, early 1st century BCE, described the city's ruins, now deserted, but still imbued with mystic power. Strabo noted, "The greater part of Babylon is so deserted that one would hesitate to say this great city is anything but a vast desert." By this time, Babylon had already become a place of legend, both a lost world of grandeur and a symbol of the ephemeral nature of civilizations. For the biblical tradition, Babylon became a central metaphor, a place of greatness and destruction, a city punished by God for its hubris. Babylon's rise and fall mirrored the biblical narrative of human pride, downfall, and eventual redemption. The Tower of Babel, rooted in Babylonian myth, is one of the most enduring biblical motifs, symbolizing humanity's ambition to reach the heavens and the punishment that followed the confusion of languages. The Bible's Genesis 11:1-9 presents the tower as a warning against human arrogance, echoing the ambition behind Babylon's ancient ziggurats. Babylon's later destruction is recorded in the Book of Daniel and the Book of Jeremiah, where it is portrayed as the symbol of idolatry and sin. O daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction, happy is the one who repays you according to what you have done to us. Psalm 137 verse 8. Here Babylon's fall is seen not as a mere political event, but as divine justice. The destruction of Babylon was inevitable, a divine reckoning for its idolatry, oppression, and immorality. Yet, in the book of Daniel, Babylon is portrayed as the realm of dreams and visions, a place where Nebuchadnezzar's dreams foretold the rise and fall of empires. The Bible acknowledges Babylon's power, but it presents it in a context of divine manipulation. In Islamic tradition, Babylon also holds significance, though often distorted by legend. The city's fall and rise are framed as part of a larger divine plan, mirroring many of the same themes found in Greek and biblical stories. The Quran, Surah 2:102, references the story of Harut and Marut, two angels sent to Babylon. They taught magic, but their teachings were twisted, leading to human corruption. They followed what the devils gave out during the reign of Solomon, and the two angels at Babylon, Harut and Marut. Babylon in this context becomes a place of moral warning where knowledge, if misused, leads to destruction. Islamic traditions also invoke Babylon through the story of Nebuchadnezzar, though in some versions he is associated with kingly tyranny. In Islamic accounts, Babylon's ultimate fall reflects the limits of human power and the wisdom of God's will. In the centuries following Babylon's fall, the city became more legend than history. Greek, biblical, and Islamic stories shaped Babylon into a symbol of the destructive power of ambition, defiance, and divine vengeance. Herodotus' exaggerations transformed the real city into a mystical wonder. Biblical narratives turned Babylon into a sinister warning, a place of great wickedness destined for destruction. Islamic tales entwined Babylon with magical lore and divine testing, making it a land where both knowledge and hubris had dire consequences. Babylon did not fall in a day. Its glory faded, but its contributions remain. Its walls may have crumbled, its kings may have been forgotten, but its legacy is woven into the very fabric of our civilization. Babylon's greatest legal achievement, the Code of Hammurabi, stands as a towering monument to the ancient world's desire for justice, order, and fairness. Codified around 1754 BCE, Hammurabi's code was one of the first written law codes in human history. It laid the groundwork for future legal systems, influencing Roman law, Islamic jurisprudence, and even modern legal principles. The Code of Hammurabi covered everything from property rights to marriage contracts and trade regulations, establishing a framework that reflected both equity and retribution. It didn't just enforce justice, it normalized the idea of justice as a social contract that could be publicly known, respected, and enforced. An eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. This phrase, often cited from the code, may seem harsh, but in its time, it ensured a proportional response to wrongdoing, restoring balance in society. Hammurabi's code remains a touchstone of early civilization, reminding us of the importance of written laws and the formalized role of rulers in maintaining order. While the Babylonian Empire eventually crumbled, its astronomical legacy continued to shape the way we understand the cosmos today. Babylonian astronomers were among the first to systematically observe the movement of the stars, planets, and moon. They predicted lunar eclipses with a precision unmatched until the 19th century. Their work on the Saros cycle, a period used to predict eclipses, was more accurate than anything recorded in Western Europe for over 1,000 years. The Emuel.Appin tablets, ancient astronomical texts preserved in cuneiform, cataloged the movements of the planets and provided detailed star maps that guided the Babylonian calendar. Ziggurats served not only as religious temples but also as astronomical observatories. The Babylonians measured the solstices, equinoxes, and other key points of celestial alignment, providing the foundation for astrology and astronomical navigation. The Babylonian system of constellations, which influenced the Greeks and the Romans, forms the base of the zodiac we use today. Their focus on the stars and the heavens was, in many ways, a reflection of their belief that the universe operated according to divine principles: order, balance, and prediction. One of Babylon's most enduring contributions is its mathematical system. The Babylonians used a base 60 sexagesimal numeral system, a legacy that persists today in our 60-second minute, 60-minute hour, and 360-degree circle. They were also masters of geometry, using practical methods to measure land, calculate volumes, and construct architectural wonders. Babylonian mathematicians worked out solutions to complex problems in algebra and trigonometry, using tables of reciprocals and advanced multiplication methods. They had an early understanding of the concept of zero, though it wasn't fully developed as a numeral until later. Babylon's mathematical innovations were not just abstract exercises. They were used for practical purposes, from building the massive ziggurats to organizing agricultural and trade practices across the empire. Babylonian cuneiform, one of the earliest writing systems in human history, was a medium of communication, governance, and culture. Cuneiform allowed the Babylonians to record laws, keep trade accounts, preserve religious texts, and transmit knowledge across generations. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the world's oldest surviving literary works, was preserved in Babylonian cuneiform, demonstrating the culture's rich oral and literary traditions. Cuneiform was also used to document royal decrees, contracts, and trade transactions, allowing the empire to function with a level of bureaucratic complexity that would later be emulated by empires like Rome and Persia. Babylon was a city of scribes, where education in cuneiform writing was mandatory for a select few. These scribes played a central role in administering the empire, preserving its religious rituals, and even ensuring the survival of its scientific knowledge. Babylonian kingship was not just a political office, it was a sacred responsibility. Kings like Hammurabi and Nebuchadnezzar II ruled as both political leaders and divine representatives on earth, charged with upholding Marduk's will and protecting the empire's sacred order. Rulers were expected to maintain cosmic balance by honoring the gods and ensuring that temples were properly funded and rituals performed. The Babylonian king was a mediator between heaven and earth, seen as the one who could intervene in divine matters, ensuring that the gods remained favorable to the city. The ritual humiliation of the king during the Akita festival, where the king would bow before the god Marduk and even be struck by the high priest, symbolized the king's humility before divine will. This understanding of kingship would influence both Persian and Greek royal traditions. Babylon's religious architecture was both functional and symbolic. Temples were more than places of worship, they were cosmic engines, designed to bring the divine into the earthly realm. The Asagila temple, dedicated to Marduk, was not just the heart of Babylonian worship, it was the center of the city's religious and political power. Ziggurats, like the famous Etemenanki, were designed as sacred mountains that connected heaven and earth, serving as platforms for divine communication. The Ishtar Gate, adorned with glazed bricks featuring mythical creatures, symbolized the journey into the divine realm, marking a city built on ritual and power. The Babylonian religious architecture inspired countless later empires, from the Persians to the Greeks and Romans, shaping how they viewed the relationship between power, divinity, and urban life. In every facet of life, from law to science, writing to kingship, religion to architecture, Babylon set the foundations for the modern world. Babylonian astronomy laid the groundwork for Western science. Mathematical systems formed the structure for modern engineering and timekeeping. Legal codes influenced Roman and modern law. Cuneiform writing became the model for Western alphabetic scripts. Kingship and religious architecture influenced how rulers and temples were structured in later empires. Babylon, though eventually overrun by time and empires, remains the cornerstone of urban civilization, its lessons echoing through the ages. For centuries, the splendor of Babylon had been buried beneath layers of sand and time. Its walls, once adorned with the blue-glazed bricks of the Ishtar Gate, lay forgotten. Its towering ziggurats, which had once touched the sky, reduced to rubble. Yet the city was not forgotten. It was merely sleeping, waiting to be unearthed. The rediscovery of Babylon began in the 19th century, when European archaeologists, driven by a thirst for uncovering ancient wonders, ventured into what is now modern-day Iraq. German archaeologist Robert Koldewey is often credited with the systematic excavation of Babylon in the early 1900s, particularly his famous work on the Ishtar Gate and the Processional Way. Koldewey's team meticulously excavated the gates and found that they were adorned with vibrant blue-glazed bricks, depicting reliefs of lions, dragons, and bulls, symbolic creatures of Babylonian gods like Marduk and Adad. These intricate designs were not just for aesthetic beauty but served as representations of divine protection over the city. The Ishtar Gate, once a towering entrance to the city, was reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum in Berlin, where it still stands as a monumental symbol of Babylon's grandeur. Its massive, awe-inspiring form echoes the divine power and cultural sophistication that Babylon once projected. In the heart of Babylon, excavations uncovered many bricks stamped with Nebuchadnezzar II's name. These bricks, which he had commissioned for his building projects, revealed his obsession with monumental architecture and his desire to immortalize himself in the very structures of the city. Nebuchadnezzar's bricks were inscribed with inscriptions such as, "I built a city of bricks that will endure forever. May my name be praised for eternity." This inscription speaks not only of Nebuchadnezzar's ambition to immortalize Babylon but also of his obsession with legacy. His constructions were meant to outlast time, to make sure his name and Babylon's greatness were recorded for future generations. These bricks were found in abundance throughout Babylon, marking the streets walked by kings, the gates where processions passed, and the foundations of temples dedicated to the gods. Each brick tells a story of a city that lived and breathed through its architecture, standing as a testament to an era of divine kingship. One of the most remarkable discoveries of modern archaeology was the Processional Way, the grand avenue leading through the Ishtar Gate toward the temple precinct of Asagila, where the great god Marduk was worshipped. This avenue, paved with colorful bricks, was once the site of royal processions and religious festivals, particularly the annual New Year's Akita festival. As Nebuchadnezzar II was paraded along the Processional Way, the streets were alive with music, rituals, and worship, marking Babylon as a center of divine kingship and piety. The sacred ceremonies that took place along these streets symbolized not just the power of the king, but also his role as the mediator between gods and men. Archaeologists uncovered detailed reliefs and inscriptions along the Processional Way, some depicting gods and mythical creatures. These reliefs weren't just for aesthetic purposes but were intended to mark the king's divine right to rule and to display the favor of the gods. These discoveries have allowed modern viewers a glimpse into the grand ceremonies that once graced Babylon, where kings and scribes walked hand in hand, both powerful and learned. The streets were not just functional, they were part of a ritualized life, where every step was a tribute to Babylon's greatness and its divine favor. Perhaps one of the most enduring symbols of Babylon is the Etemenanke Ziggurat, the great temple tower dedicated to Marduk. Though the structure itself has largely crumbled, archaeological efforts have helped to reveal its sheer scale and awe-inspiring height. The ziggurat, often associated with the Tower of Babel in later biblical lore, was an architectural feat. It stood as a symbol of Babylon's relationship with the heavens. The temple precinct was thought to be the place where the earth and the gods met, and the ziggurat itself was designed to give the impression of a mountain reaching the sky. Excavations of the ziggurat's base revealed large stone steps and foundations, some of which were used by Babylonian priests who walked the steps to perform sacred rituals. Their robes and offerings, carried with reverence, reflected the profound importance of Babylon as a spiritual and political hub. While the structure itself was never fully restored, its presence in the archaeological record continues to define the identity of Babylon as a city of divinity, its peak forever aimed towards the heavens, even if only in ruins now. The rediscovery of Babylon was not simply about unearthing stones. It was about bringing a lost world back to life. The bricks, streets, and gates were all pieces of a larger puzzle, each fragment telling the story of a civilization that left a lasting imprint on history. Ishtar Gate's reconstruction in the Pergamon Museum gives us a direct connection to the past, offering a visual testament to the skill and artistry of Babylonian craftsmanship. The blue-glazed bricks still shine, an enduring symbol of Babylon's architectural ingenuity. Modern archaeologists, using cutting-edge technology, continue to work in the ruins, uncovering tablets, inscriptions, and artifacts that tell of Babylon's daily life, its religious practices, and its cosmopolitan culture. While Babylonian civilization has long faded, archaeology has allowed us to step into its shoes, to walk the very streets once trod by Nebuchadnezzar and the scribes who recorded their history. Each excavation site is a living link to the past, allowing us to understand Babylon's contribution to the foundation of urban civilization. Civilizations rise. They burn bright, casting their shadows far and wide. But like the stars they study, they too must fade, their brilliance dimming with the passage of time. And yet, in their fall, they leave something behind. Something that endures. A whisper carried on the wind. A story written in stone. Babylon was not just a city. It was the epicenter of human ambition, a place where the dreams of kings, priests, and scribes intertwined with the forces of the gods themselves. Nebuchadnezzar too built it with his own hands, his ambition etched into the bricks of the city. His Ishtar Gate rose from the earth like a portal between the divine and the human, its blue-glazed tiles still telling the world about the gods he revered and the empire he forged. The Etemenanke ziggurat towered as a monument to mankind's desire to reach the heavens, to bridge the gap between earth and the divine. For centuries, Babylon was a beacon, the seat of legal codes, astronomy, mathematics, and writing, a place where humanity began to define its place in the world, to measure the heavens, and to understand the very laws that governed its existence. But like all great civilizations, Babylon's grandeur was not eternal. Its walls fell to invaders. Its temples crumbled under the weight of neglect and conquest. Its gods were displaced and its kings lost to history. What remained was a city abandoned, a memory and a whisper of its past. Babylon's final days were not marked by a cataclysmic end, but by a slow disintegration, a city of great minds and mighty kings that was gradually forgotten, as Seleucia rose and Ctesiphon flourished in the shadows of its ruins. Scribes and priests moved east, and the great ceremonies that had once filled the processional way with song and celebration became mere echoes in the wind. Yet, even as Babylon was physically erased, its influence lingered, carried on the shoulders of those who remembered its knowledge, its power, and its ambition. Today, the ruins of Babylon serve as more than just archaeological remains. They are a symbol, a timeless reminder of what humanity can achieve, and how quickly it can fall. Babylon is no longer a city in the desert, but an idea that has been woven into the fabric of human civilization. Greek scholars, in their wonder and awe, mythologized Babylon, turning it into a place of mysticism, where the ancient gods once walked. Biblical texts transformed it into the ultimate symbol of sin and destruction, a warning to future generations about the dangers of hubris, a place where the Tower of Babel reached for the heavens, only to fall in divine wrath. Islamic tradition gave it new life through the story of Harut and Marut, two angels sent to teach, but whose lessons were twisted into magic and corruption. Through these stories, Babylon continues to speak, not as a mere historical entity, but as a timeless symbol of human ambition, folly, and resilience. We are like the cities we build, ever reaching, ever expanding, ever hoping to carve a place for ourselves in the world. Babylon reminds us that greatness comes with inevitable decay, that all we build may one day return to the earth, swallowed by time. Yet, what we leave behind is eternal. It's the laws we create that shape societies, echoing through the centuries, influencing cultures long after our names are forgotten. It's the knowledge we share that guides future generations, lighting the path forward when all else is dark. It's the architecture we build, rising toward the heavens, that shows how far humanity can reach and how fragile our creations can be. In Babylon's ruins we find not just a dead city, but the essence of human civilization itself, our ambition, our dreams, and our inevitable fall. Yet, it also reflects our ability to rise, to remember, and to learn from the past. Babylon may have crumbled, but it has never truly disappeared. Its bricks still shape our cities. Its stars still guide us. Its laws still form the foundation of the world we live in. As we've journeyed through the rise, fall, and lasting legacy of Babylon, it's clear that its story is far from over. The echoes of this ancient city continue to resonate through the ages in our laws, our sciences, and our shared human experience. If you found Babylon's legacy as fascinating as we have, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Dive deeper into the mysteries of the past with us, and let us know in the comments, what part of Babylon's history left you in awe? And for those who haven't subscribed yet, what's holding you back? Tell us why and let's continue the conversation. Babylon's story is far from finished, let's keep it alive together.